And now let's introduce Jennifer Steger, Assistant Professor of Art History at Johns Hopkins University. She received her PhD in art history from UC Berkeley, and her focus is on art and architecture of the ancient Mediterranean and their afterlives, the afterlives being important for us today, and plus theories of color and materiality, feminisms, cultural exchange, and ancient Greek and Roman medicine. Her first book is currently under review, titled Seeing Ancient Mediterranean Color, which considers material colors across dyes, pigments, stones, resins, and metal, not only in painting and sculpture, as you can tell, but also jewelry and mosaics, to consider theories of color and vision, what might be concluded from past use of color and past writing about color, and more, of course. She has also collaborated as a curator on several projects, including notably the exhibition Picasso and Rivera that was held at the LA County Museum of Art and the Museo del Palacio de Bellas Artes in New Mexico, which considered Picasso's engagement with the ancient Mediterranean art alongside Diego Rivera's with the ancient art of the Americas. She writes for the public as well as for the academic community, including arts criticism and creative nonfiction. And one work in progress is titled Public Feminisms in a Time of Crisis with Lila Easa. And for those of you who may be wondering why we were opening an Asian art series with a talk on the ancient Mediterranean, I think you will soon see how her work offers us different ways of thinking about color, problems and drawing conclusions about color use in the past, and challenging some attitudes and assumptions towards color. I'll turn it over to Professor Steger with a big thank you to her for sharing your work with us.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that kind introduction. And I'm also very grateful for the invitation, which prompted me to explore a topic that I had encountered but had not pursued while working on my larger book project. So this has sort of invited me to look further. And thank you also to Cooper Whitlow for the tech support and for all of you who've joined us here on a Saturday. It's my great pleasure to start off this series on color in Asian art, material and meaning at the Asian Art Museum. This is a rich series with many exciting talks in the lineup, and I'm going to try to set the stage for some of the cultural and political histories surrounding the subject of color. I wish, of course, that we could walk the galleries after the talk, but I'm grateful that technology allows us to safely gather and connect amidst the pandemic. I've organized my talk today around a red material often called dragon's blood, and I'm going to share my screen. I've organized my talk today around a red material that is often called dragon's blood, although as we'll see, there are some other names given to it as well. And through this materialist lens, I'm going to trace the emergence of a critique of vibrant color in general, and of dragon's blood in particular, in a passage from the conservative Roman historian Pliny the Elder's Natural History. This influential Latin text of the 1st century BCE has played an outsized role in the discipline of art history, sometimes an invisible outsized role, but an outsized role nonetheless. And I argue in presenting color as characteristic of far-off lands in the East. Pliny has played a role in separating the colors of Greco-Roman antiquity from the colors of other cultures with whom they were in rich and extended contact in the ancient world. A complexity of Pliny's text, as we will see, is that he both catalogs the vibrant material color of the ancient Mediterranean world and simultaneously condemns the very abundance that he documents. But first, let's speak of blood and dragons. Let me see. You might have to move the speaker view around so that you can see all of this, the full slides. Dragon's blood is produced. It's a bright red resin that's produced by a number of trees and shrubs, all largely within the Dracaena species. And it can be used as a paint pigment as well as an additive varnish, and also from its earliest antiquity for medicinal purposes. And sometimes it's also called sang de dragon. When one cuts into a Dracaena cinnabari tree, a bright red resin comes forth. This resin is colloquially called dragon's blood, and you can see an example of the thick resin here. A variety of trees and shrubs within the Dracaena family release this resin. These plants are found in the Socotra archipelago, throughout the Indian subcontinent, North Africa and Spain, as well as southwestern South America. A text written in Greek by an Egyptian merchant in the 1st century BCE, the Periplus, or the sailing around of the Erythraean Sea, describes a maritime route, which is documented here in a diagram produced by George Tsiagalakis, and it's his intellectual content here in the map. It describes a maritime route, ports and harbors running from the Red Sea towards India. And dragon's blood as a resin and pigment likely moved along this maritime route. Since antiquity, dragon's blood has been used to produce pigments like the one that you see here. And I have, if we were in person, I could pass this around, but I have a little example at home from Kramer Pigments, which has the most amazing historical pigment collection, if you're interested. Since it has been used to produce pigments like the one that you see here, as well as a number of medicinal purposes. And this range of purposes persists in later centuries as well. So in the 16th century, you see it here used as a varnish. It's the red sections of the frame, and this is an example from the Met. And as a suspected but unconfirmed ingredient in the varnish used by Stradivarius on his iconic violins in the 17th and 18th centuries, and still used in certain high-end rosins for the bows. So the example on the right, the rosin, is something you could still purchase today if you were a violinist. And it has continued to be used historically for medicinal purposes, as you see in these little apothecary jars. And in preparing for this talk, I was surprised to discover that dragon's blood has become something of a favorite in the beauty industry in recent years, purporting to firm, smooth, and plump the skin. It's also, I discovered, been added to smudge sticks for sale on the lifestyle site Etsy to heighten the stick's capacity to purify and protect. While the ancient history and expansive geography of the resin have become elements of value in contemporary society, the very cultural connections that dragon's blood and other pigments and dyes mapped in the ancient Mediterranean emerged as reason for critique, for some, by the 1st century BCE. And I want to emphasize that Pliny and other writers who launched this kind of critique, they're writing from their own specific subject position. We have wide examples of color from the ancient world that they are actually positioning themselves against. So in some ways, the written record and the material record are in some opposition. These cultural and material connections cut against arguments about ancient Greek and Roman exceptionalism and rewrite the histories of shared materials and artistic practices across the wider Mediterranean world. Colors connect ancient Mediterranean artists with artists working in the ancient Near East and Egypt, and also across the maritime trade route described in the Periplus. Thus, colors come to map a wide geographic set of networks, both trade networks and social networks. Perhaps it's because of these very cross-cultural connections that material colors afford that so much work over the centuries has been dedicated into excising them from conventional histories, especially of Greek and Roman art. And so I'm going to turn now to a brief account of this excision. For the opening ceremony of the 2004 Olympic Games in Athens, Dimitris Papaionou organized Clepsydra, or Hourglass, a procession of volunteer living bodies that told a story of Greek art from 2000 BCE to the time of Alexander the Great in tableaux vivants. And here you can see some of the volunteer actors being made up for their roles. So this thick white pigment is being applied to their faces. The director calls his very deliberate use of color an economy of color, restricting it largely to the Bronze Age, pictured here, and the Hellenistic periods, while going to great lengths to costume the bodies of performers who represented the art of the 6th to 4th centuries BCE in white monochrome. And here you can see some of these living actors. They've got body paint and body costumes to give them this fully monochrome appearance, and also the musculature is coming from the costume too. Volunteers portraying choroi, naked idealized male dedications, and chorai, richly adorned, clothed female dedications produced in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. These actors wore thick white face and body paint, as well as white muscle suits or white dresses. The construction of these monochrome white bodies required significant preparation. And there's actually a making of video that you can find on Vimeo of all of the actors getting ready for this performance, which is better than the actual performance itself in some ways, because you get this inside take of their theatric preparation. The construction of these monochrome bodies required significant preparation and stood out dramatically on stage in contrast with the colors of the earlier and later art bodies. This costume of monochrome whiteness, this is my favorite slide, visually separated the 6th to 4th centuries BCE, a period traditionally referred to by scholars as the classical period, from the art of earlier and later periods, even in the Mediterranean. Yet, as Johanna Henning has argued, clepsydra resisted centuries of research for the lost colors of these ancient sculptures, as well as the extant pigments that are still visible on the original sculptures, many of which are currently on view in the New Acropolis Museum in Athens. So in fact, as they were staging this in Athens in monochrome, you could have seen this one night and gone to visit the New Acropolis Museum the next day, where you would see a number of pigments still extant on some of the sculptures that were replicated in the tableau vivant. A centerpiece of this tableau vivant was the person playing the part of the famous sculpture of the Athena Parthenos. This is the sculpture for which the Parthenon on the Acropolis was built. She wore the appropriate iconographic signifiers, a helmet, an aegis with Medusa's decapitated head strapped across her chest, and she also held the white statue of a goddess of victory in her open palm. This volunteer actress, costumed in white paint and cloth, however, played the role of a colossal statue famed in antiquity for its vivid material polychromy. While the ancient colossal statue has long since disappeared, the main fact that we know about the original is that it was built up from vibrant materials and brilliant colors. And here you see a reconstruction that it's possible to visit in person in Nashville, Tennessee. In the mid-5th century, artists in the workshop of the artist Phidias fitted plates of gold and ivory onto a core of cypress wood, laid in precious stones such as chalcedony, lapis lazuli, and obsidian, and layered on bright pigments in order to form the colossal statue of Athena in her guise as Parthenos, or young virgin. From the statue's public dedication on the Acropolis in 438, the Athena Parthenos presided over the interior of the purpose-built Parthenon, installed in the heart of the Acropolis and produced in the wake of victory over the Persians at a moment of celebrated democratic and imperial power for Athens. The gold statue, as it was known, was already famous in antiquity, and it remains central to accounts of Mediterranean art. The Parthenos, however, did not conform to the sort of monolithic, monochrome white whole that later beholders have come to seek from the classical past, and that Papaioniou staged for the 2004 Olympic Games. Instead, the statue insisted on and was valued for its pieced together polychrome material colors. This gap between modern performance of the past and ancient, vibrant materiality is a metaphor for the status of color itself. In recent years, a series of exhibitions and articles, including the video that is in the chat link, starring next week's speaker, Marco Leona, a series of exhibitions and articles have emphasized the shocking contrast between seemingly monochrome marble and bronze sculptures, from which pigments and alloys have been stripped or lost, and those on which extant pigments and materials remain or have been reconstituted. And I want to emphasize that this has really been the labor of conservation scientists, conservators, and curators collaborating together to bring these conversations to the public sphere in recent decades. Sculpture has long been the priority medium of the reception of the art of the ancient Mediterranean, and it has remained so in the work to reconstitute colors. Even so, although the evidence for colors from every period and across different media of ancient Mediterranean art continues to accumulate, until very recently, scholars have often excluded sculpture produced during the 6th to 4th centuries BCE from the polychrome reconstructions. So the idea of colors in and on the art produced during the rise and height of the short-lived Athenian democracy and the Periclean building project on the Acropolis in Athens has generated the most resistance, even among polychromy researchers. And here you can see a digital reconstruction that tries to offset the vast white sculpture hall of the Parthenon marbles that are in London in the British Museum. Ongoing study, however, has continued to demonstrate what antiquarian travelers observed in the late 18th and 19th centuries, that colors were an integral part of artistic production in all media and across all periods, including on the building and artistic program of the Parthenon itself. Most of the work on ancient Mediterranean color has been devoted to proving the case for or against the presence of colors on ancient Greco-Roman sculpture, or once proven to documenting technical discoveries of additional pigments and associated shifts in iconographic interpretation. These discoveries have typically been fitted into a traditional narrative of archaic schematism, progressing towards classical naturalism, so that color comes to be taken in these cases as a tool of mimesis. And you'll often hear people talk about the lifelikeness of color. And I really want to push back against the idea that adding colors to sculpture makes them more lifelike specifically. This is a narrative partly outlined in the Latin text to which I will turn in the final section of today's talk. We should, I argue, approach color a different way, to ask what color might do in ancient art and with ancient beholders. The modern explanation for the phenomenon of color as a property of light differs significantly from ancient Mediterranean ideas about color, although at all times, color is complex and hard to fix. So there are debates about what colors are in antiquity as well, in a variety of languages and texts. But in general, they seem to take a different position from the one that Newton espoused in Optics of 1704. This difference is important because our responses to the color worlds of antiquity are conditioned by fundamentally different explanations for color. So here you see this color circle, which was published in black and white as a drawing in 1704. And here you can see some of his journals in which he's, before publishing the study, working through how he imagines or thinks prismatic color works. In optics, Newton describes sunlight passing through a prism so that the spectrum of light visible to the human eye is bent and produces colors of various wavelengths. For our purposes, two aspects of Newton's idea are important. First, although he had some detractors, Newton's ideas about color come to be widely accepted, especially in the Anglophone world. So after Newton, color is generally taken to be a property of light. And because light has no tangible material presence, because we can't touch or contain a photon, the shorthand for Newton's discovery is that color is a property of light, so that it's no longer envisioned as something material. It's understood as outside of matter. And I'm not suggesting that he's incorrect about how prismatic color worked. I hope there are no physicists on the webinar. But Newton lived, worked, and produced ideas in the late 17th and early 18th centuries CE in Britain. And his ideas continue to define how we think and talk about color today. And although this isn't the full focus of my talk, reinstating the materiality of color to ancient Greek art radically changes the story. So color in ancient Mediterranean was understood to inhere in materials. And in their materiality, those colors mapped networks of connection. So the ancient Mediterranean conception of color as material, which I think is shared by lots of their contact cultures as well, as opposed to the modern conception of color as prismatic, alters the status of color in antiquity. Debates over the presence or absence of color in ancient Mediterranean art have centered around, as these examples show, the medium of sculpture, which has been the priority medium for classical reception. But color is transmedial. And we know that, for example, painters and sculptors regularly collaborated in antiquity. In contrast to the question of sculpture, there's been little debate, maybe no debate, about the presence of colors in ancient paintings. A Greek philosopher writing in the 5th century BCE, Empedocles of Acragas, used the metaphor of a painter covering objects with variegated additive pigments to describe the way matter mixes in the world. And I'm going to paraphrase this beautiful fragment here. The passage reads something like, just as this painter mixes many colored pigments by hand and creates from these mixed pigments many whole forms, so do material substances craft or form the forms of the universe. So for Empedocles, the metaphor of a painter, and he's certainly not the only writer using artistic metaphors to talk about philosophy, the metaphor of a painter mixing many colored pigments by hand helped to describe the vibrant material color of the living world. This painter mixes many colored pigments, and in the ancient Mediterranean, the support on which a painter might paint ranged from wooden panels, ceramic vessels, freestanding sculpture in terracotta, limestone, marble, or bronze, or architectural relief. Here are some more material colors that I had the privilege of making at a workshop at Penn State. And there are more and more of these opportunities for you as well to try to either produce pigments yourself or buy historical pigments from Kramer or somebody else and then try to work with them at home. But I would recommend, obviously not in the virtual context, but seizing the opportunity to try to really touch these pigments because they have a whole kind of full sensory experience of smell, different textures, etc., that you really can only access through contact. So here's one example of a wooden pinax that was produced in Greece in the 6th century BC. So I'm going to turn from the conversation about the excision of color really centers around sculpture. And I'm going to turn in this latter part of the talk to painting more specifically. And this group of female figures is painted with pigments on wood at the end of the 6th century BCE. And so with this image in mind, I'd like us to look at the Pliny passage from which this talk takes its title. On the one hand, painting requires material color, and its necessary presence in ancient Greek painting is not in dispute. But on the other hand, few examples of what we might call freestanding painting remain extant in the Greek-speaking world. Later texts describe a robust painting tradition in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, but as we will see, their characterizations of earlier painters are told from their own 1st century BC perspectives. So Pliny the Elder was writing in the 1st century BC. He likely finished the natural history just before his death in 77 BCE. The natural history, which drew on texts produced by people who were writing earlier than he and in other languages, included 37 books. And here's one of the earliest known portraits of Pliny, not from antiquity at all, but on the outside of a cathedral in Como, Italy, thought to be his birthplace. And I just tried to pull out, he's encased in this little screened area, but pull out where he is on the cathedral facade. So it's sort of this interesting integration of Pliny into a Catholic church facade, but much later. So people would describe the kind of encyclopedist that he was as something similar, perhaps, to a Wikipedian. And here's Pliny's own Wikipedia page. I do want to emphasize that a big distinction is that Pliny produces all 37 books himself, and that they're arranged, organized, and written from his own subject position. So while Wikipedia has lots of controls in place to try to mitigate the subject positions of its writers and to control for writer bias, Pliny is trying to shape the entire text. And in some ways, the way we've consumed his text has prevented us, as Saoirse Carey has argued, I think persuasively, prevented us from seeing his text in its full complexity. So here is a page of book 1, and this is again from a much later manuscript in the 15th century. You can actually access this online in the Bodleian Library. And you can see in the historiated letter D in that center is a depiction of Pliny working on his manuscript. So his text, it covers all manner of things, even though the passage that we're going to talk about in more detail is specifically addressing painting. His text covers plants. And I pulled all of these historiated letters, which are the big letter at the start of a manuscript, to give you an idea of the way in which the manuscript in its later reception tradition is illustrated to try to give the reader an indication of what each chapter will cover. So plants, including over here, something that might look a little bit like a Socotra tree, birds, fish, bees, and animals. And I would just ask you to keep this elephant in mind as we come a little farther into Pliny's text. Because he's going to come back. And geographies. So here we have a depiction of Earth, but then also the Black Sea, North Africa, and Spain. So an interest in the wide geography from which materials coming in and out of the Roman Empire were traveling. And finally, sorry, the doctors and magicians. I almost skipped over them. This is actually incredibly important. And my second project has ended up really focusing on ancient medicine, and it came out of my work on ancient color because so many of the same artist pigments like dragon's blood, are used for medicinal purposes as well. And this is something that's just woven into Pliny's text. He talks about a pigment, he'll talk about a pigment and he'll address how it's used by artists and how it was used by doctors. And so these are some depictions of the magicians and doctors, and there is some slippage there, who appear in Pliny's text and the kind of objects that might be part of, for example, here a plant, medicinal practice in antiquity. And finally, artists. He has a section that has been much mined by art historians of bronze workers, painters, and sculptors. And here are the historiated letters depicting them hard at work. And these have been a really rich source for art historians, but something that we have historically tended, again, I think as Saoirse Carey has pointed out very persuasively, we've tended to check in isolation, looking for facts about the ancient world that are hard to come by, and trying in some ways to check the material record against Pliny's text, rather than thinking about these sections as part of the whole natural history and what a natural history might be doing for Pliny himself. I think we should also focus on the way in which Pliny as a Romanist is writing back to ancient Greece. And he gives us a picture of ancient Greece that is really shaped by his own imagination of it, which is not to say that he doesn't have any facts about the earlier past, but he's often writing about some 500 years prior to his life. And if textually Hellenism is often filtered through Latinity, which is to say that in the reception tradition, like this one, you would encounter often a Greek text through its Latin reception. This is a doubly complex experience for material culture. So it's not just filtered through textual and material receptions of the Latin past. So I think when we're examining Pliny to understand the Greek past, we have to remember that it's filtered both through this textual practice, but also through the Roman reception of Greek art. So most commonly we dip into individual chapters in search of expertise on specific subjects, sort of the way we might consult Wikipedia today. But we should understand Pliny's rather conservative Roman nostalgia for a past that never existed as something that's really shaped by his own experience in the 1st century BCE. So he writes, let's see if I can, okay, this is the passage that I want us to focus on. It was with 4 colors only that Apelles, Echion, Melanthius, and Nicomachus, and art historians are so excited to get these names that often becomes the full focus. These most illustrious painters executed their immortal works. Millennium for white, Attic Sill for the yellow, Pontic Sinopus for the red, and Atramentum for the black. And yet a single picture of theirs has sold before now for the treasures of whole cities. But at the present day, when purple is employed for coloring walls even, and when India sends to us the slime of her rivers and the corrupt blood of her dragons and her elephants, there is no such thing as a picture of high quality produced. So this is book 35, chapter 32, and the emphasis is mine. This is a somewhat old translation. There are other translations of the Latin text, which will sometimes substitute snake for dragon, and the same word can be used to mean snake or dragon. But in this case, the play that Pliny is trying to make on the pigment dragon's blood is important for our fuller understanding. And we'll come back to this. But we might understand, ooh, that's a little pixelated. We might understand some of Pliny's cranky rejection of the art of his own contemporary moment, much the same way we hear people complaining about de-skilling in modern art. And here you see from the kind of iconic children's book, Olivia, her mother has taken her to MoMA and she sees Jackson Pollock's One and she says, I could do that in about 5 minutes. And in fact, in the book, she goes on to go home and paint her own version on the wall. And I think we need to understand Pliny's dismissal of the art of his own time as something aligned with this kind of nostalgia for a past that never existed and a condemnation of a present with which one is uncomfortable. So Pliny looked back to earlier Greek painters and said that they had worked with colors sourced from the Greek earth. And here are the 4 colors that he named, these mythical 4 colors. And he grouped these under a label that comes to be known as the 4-color palette. And in the wake of Pliny's text, scholars have dutifully sought examples of this restrained palette from the extant material record. And I just want to emphasize that there is a lot of scholarly work that has gone into trying to match what examples of ancient Greek painting we have with what we imagine these four pigments might look like. And I've pulled all of these pigment images from Kramer pigments, and they're approximations of what the four colors he names likely are. So millennium for white from the island of Milos, like the Venus de Milo, Attic sil for yellow, or an ochre from Attica, Pontic synopsis for the red, so an ochre from the Black Sea region, and atramentum or inkstone for the black. But as we'll see, the extant Greek painting that we have, although it is not free panel painting of the kind that he describes in his text, it just doesn't map to this limited palette that he describes. So in fact, the text is doing one thing, it's making one claim, and the material record is making a very different one. So here's another wooden plaque, and you can see the strong blue color, a color that's unmentioned by Pliny as in use by Greek artists. This is slightly earlier than the period that he's describing, but we have some later examples as well. So just sort of keep these in mind as we look at the text more closely. These are a beautiful set of metopes from Demetrius in Cyrene, now Libya, in the Louvre Museum. And here is an example, can't tell if here we go, of a Hellenistic painting in a wonderful book by Heraclea Brekulaki, really detailing the vibrant color throughout the Hellenistic tomb paintings. And tomb paintings afford us sort of our best set of examples of extant color in painting. So unrestrained excess, physical traces of distant geographies, bodily fluids from fantastic creatures, the base world of matter instead of the ideal world of the dematerialized genius, this persistent idea that colors contaminate. All of this finds its instantiation in the mythical restricted colors and idealized whiteness. And I would, oops. Oh, I'm gonna go back for a second. And I would just emphasize that the same idealized sculptural whiteness that we looked at as highly constructed and the act of kind of willful excision, as well as the effects of time, and this construction of an extremely limited palette that we see not actually manifesting in the material record. These two constructions, both in sculpture and in painting, are aligned in terms of their practices. This myth of an earlier, simpler time of limited local colors. And I want to come a little earlier in the text where he says, but at the present day when purple is employed for coloring walls even. And the purple that he's referring to, if we could be in person again, I would pass this around. This, I don't know how well you can see on the webinar, but this tiny, tiny amount of pigment is $100 in contemporary economies. And if you take the lid off, it has a very, very strong smell of shellfish because it's a Tyrian purple that's produced from shellfish. And it was extraordinarily expensive as a dye in antiquity and reserved for the very wealthy. So this idea that you would paint your walls in a color of this expense, he is invoking to suggest that people in his own moment are painting so extravagantly. They're wasting money on this extraordinarily expensive pigment. Tyrian purple, so Tyre from the coast of Syria, Palestine, and present-day Lebanon. Here you can see, oh, this was my attempt to show the relationship between the construction of whiteness in the sculpture and the construction of whiteness in his limited palette. And here are the shellfish from which Tyrian purple is produced, and a kind of ground up version of the pigment. Apparently they had more resources than I did to produce. So the purple that's produced from shellfish found along the coast and traded by Phoenician traders. Pliny's, however, contemporary, the architectural historian Vitruvius, makes a very similar claim, not about purple painted walls, but about red walls. In her book on Vitruvius, Martin Nichols has identified this similarly conservative position taken by the author by that author against expensive colors, attaching to their use and misuse questions of character. So there's this sort of ethical implication that is latent in both Vitruvius's text and Pliny's, that the use of these expensive colors is somehow a condemnation of the person using them. But Pliny indicates that there's a confusion about these three colors. Sorry, in the Vitruvian text, the color that he is referring to is called minium. And so it would seem to be a different color from dragon's blood with a different history and source of production. But Pliny indicates that there's some confusion about these three colors. The color terms minium, cinnabar, and dragon's blood. So what the exact relationship between cinnabar and dragon's blood is, whether they're the same color or whether they're sometimes the same color and sometimes not the same color, is a little bit unclear. But this confusion seems to have taken place in antiquity. Pliny's reference to the corrupt blood of dragons and elephants at play in the color, it's a play on the color dragon's blood produced from the resin of the Dracena cinnabaris. But 2 books earlier, Pliny has described a different red pigment, cinnabar, again, one that gets conflated and may bear some relationship, in which he describes cinnabar as having been produced when a dragon or a snake is squeezed by the weight of a dying elephant. And this is why I asked you to keep that image of the elephant from Pliny in mind, because it's a very strange description. He says that the dragon has first killed the elephant by ingesting its blood. And then when the elephant has died, it collapses on the dragon and squeezes out all of the blood, which is where you get cinnabar. So when the elephant corpse crushes the dragon, the blood red comes out, much like the tree with which we first started that releases its resin. Pliny goes on to caution against this potential mix-up of cinnabar and minium, which can also be called cinnabaris nativa. Minium is highly toxic. So in another section of the natural history entitled 29.8, Evils Attendant on the Practice of Medicine, the headline, he writes, I've ascertained that it's a common thing for physicians to put mineral vermilion or minium in their medicines, a rank poison, as I shall have occasion to show when I come to speak of the pigments, in place of Indian cinnabar. So he's suggesting that sometimes doctors get confused, and instead of using Indian cinnabar or dragon's blood, they accidentally use minium, which is highly toxic and could kill the patient. And it's all because they mistake the name of the one drug for that of the other. And then in another section of the natural history, he says, this cinnabaris too is extremely useful as an ingredient in antidotes and various medicaments. But by Hercules, our physicians, because minimum also has the name of cinnabaris, use it as a substitute for the other and employ a poison. Again, this anxiety about medical mishaps and the possible toxicity of pigments that are also used as for medical care. Pliny's condemnation of expensive pigments, such as Tyrian purple and dragon's blood, evoke multiple earlier passages from his natural history, reminding the reader of the text's interlocking parts. And I don't have an example of walls covered in Tyrian purple, alas, but we can see the way in which cinnabar or minium are used in Roman painting. So we can have an example of what kind of full wall painting he's talking about. And here I'm bringing in images from the Villa of the Mysteries at Pompeii, roughly 50 BC. And this is a full room covered in which the backdrop is of cinnabar. And I'm just going to show you a few more images. Oh, here's the outside of the villa. And some of the inside with the walls. So again, we have Vitruvius critiquing the use of minium for wall paint. And then we have Pliny talking about using Tyrian purple. But both of these are expensive pigments. And in the case of minium, it's toxic. Pliny talks to us about the way in which dragon's blood and minium can be mixed up and confused. And so all of these seem to be part of the same critique of a practice that we actually see represented here at the Villa of the Mysteries. So what this collected natural history demonstrates, like the material evidence for ancient Greek colors, is that colors were both sourced locally and traded widely, and mapped these social relations through material connections. Shared across these ancient cultures is also the notion of material color and the use of material words to mark colors. Reconstituting material colors, especially additive color like paint, brings ancient Greek and Roman artistic practices into even greater alignment with practices across the wider Mediterranean, the ancient Near East, Egypt, and the root of the Periplus. Affirming connections rather than essentializing differences. It is, however, to the very connections that colors demand through trade and travel that Pliny, like Vitruvius, critiqued, positioning the use of the fantastical and far-reaching dragon's blood as antithetical to artistic quality, something countered by these very material examples of its use. A quality that he located in the mythical restriction, a high value quality that he located in the mythical restriction of colors in 4th century Greece. Given the impact of Pliny's text and its use as a documentary source, rather than a literary text subject to critical analysis, this passage has fueled the restriction and excision of color from Greek art in order to fabricate a story of difference and exceptionalism rather than relational connections.